What happens when a federal judge tells the Department of Justice, don't just make the claim, prove it? That is exactly the question surrounding a courtroom battle that has suddenly captured national attention. A recent order from a federal judge has put the DOJ under intense scrutiny, requiring government lawyers to provide additional evidence supporting their decisions in a high-profile records dispute. Could this become another routine discovery disagreement? Or is it a sign that the court expects a much higher level of accountability from the government? Stay with us, because the details behind this order reveal a legal showdown that could have consequences far beyond this single case. Welcome back. Today's story isn't about dramatic courtroom speeches or surprise witnesses. Instead, it's about something that often determines the outcome of major legal battles: credibility. In federal court, judges routinely rely on representations made by government attorneys. That trust has long been considered an important part of how the justice system functions. But in this case, the judge has decided that certain explanations alone are not enough. Instead, the court has ordered the Department of Justice to submit additional documentation so the judge can personally review whether the government's explanations are supported by the underlying evidence. At the center of the dispute is Acting Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, whose department is responding to requests involving records connected to the Epstein investigation. The court is examining whether certain documents were properly withheld or redacted, and whether the government's explanations satisfy legal requirements. It's important to note that the judge has not ruled that the Department of Justice lied or acted improperly. Rather, the court is seeking additional proof before deciding whether the government's actions were justified. That distinction matters, and throughout this video, we'll separate court findings from legal arguments and public commentary. So, how did this case reach this point? To answer that, we have to go back to the lawsuit that started it all. How the case reached. This point, the legal battle began after journalist Katie Fong challenged the government's handling of records related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. Her lawsuit argued that delays and limited access to requested records prevented meaningful public reporting on a matter of significant public interest. According to the lawsuit, the government had not fully complied with legal obligations governing the release of certain records. The Department of Justice, however, has maintained that some information cannot simply be released without careful review. Officials have argued that documents may contain sensitive information, including material involving victims, witnesses, ongoing law enforcement concerns, or legally protected information. As the case progressed, the federal judge reviewed arguments from both sides. Earlier in the litigation, the court ordered the government to produce additional materials, explain certain redactions, and address questions about records that had not yet been provided. According to the court filings discussed in your uploaded transcript, the judge also sought explanations regarding translated foreign language documents and document logs identifying withheld material. Weeks later, the judge concluded that the government's latest written response did not fully answer the court's concerns. Instead of accepting those explanations at face value, the judge issued another order requiring the DOJ to submit specific, unredacted documents directly to the court for in-camera review, a legal process in which the judge privately examines evidence before deciding whether it should remain confidential or be disclosed. This step is significant because it allows the judge to independently verify whether the government's explanations are supported by the documents themselves. At this stage, the court is not making a final determination about misconduct. Rather, it is gathering the information necessary to decide whether the government's claims regarding redactions and withheld material are legally justified. That careful process reflects how federal courts often resolve disputes involving sensitive government records. As the case entered its next phase, one question became impossible to ignore. Why wasn't the judge satisfied with the DOJ's explanation? In many federal cases, judges rely on representations made by government lawyers. Courts often presume that attorneys appearing before them are acting in good faith, unless there is a reason to examine the evidence more closely. But in this dispute, the judge decided that written explanations alone were not enough. Instead, the court ordered the government to submit unredacted documents for in-camera review. That means the judge, not the public and not the opposing party, will privately inspect the records before deciding whether the government's redactions and withholding decisions were appropriate. That distinction is important. Some headlines have suggested the judge concluded the DOJ was dishonest. But the court's order is more measured than that. Rather than making a finding of misconduct, the judge is asking for evidence that supports the government's position before deciding the next step. This is a common judicial tool when disputes involve sensitive information. For example, if the government argues that certain names must remain confidential because they involve victims or law enforcement personnel, a judge may review the original documents privately to determine whether those claims are legally justified. It's a process designed to balance two competing interests. On one side is the public's interest in transparency. On the other is the government's responsibility to protect confidential information where the law requires it. Finding that balance is rarely simple, and that's exactly why this case has drawn attention far beyond the courtroom. Legal analysts from across the political spectrum are watching closely, not necessarily because they expect an immediate ruling, but because the judge's next decision could clarify how courts expect federal agencies to justify withholding records in high-profile cases. The judge's review could ultimately lead to several different outcomes. The court might conclude the government's explanations are fully supported. It could determine that additional records should be released, or it could require further briefing before reaching any final decision. At this point, all of those possibilities remain open, and that uncertainty is what makes the next phase of the case so important. What this could mean for Todd Blanche and the DOJ. So, where does Todd Blanche fit into all of this? As a senior Justice Department official, Blanche represents the department's legal position in matters involving the federal government. Because of that role, criticism directed at the DOJ's handling of the case inevitably draws attention to its leadership. However, it's important to separate political commentary from what the court has actually said. The judge has not found Todd Blanche personally liable for misconduct. The court has not ruled that the Department of Justice intentionally misled the court. Instead, the judge has required additional documentation before deciding whether the government's explanations can be accepted. That may sound like a technical distinction, but in federal litigation, those distinctions matter enormously. Judges often proceed one careful step at a time. Rather than making assumptions, they build a record supported by evidence. That's precisely what appears to be happening here. If the judge determines that the submitted documents fully support the government's explanations, the dispute over those records could largely come to an end. If, however, the judge concludes that the evidence does not match the government's representations, the court has a range of options available under federal procedure. Those could include ordering further production of documents or taking other procedural steps, depending on the facts established during the case. Importantly, no such sanctions or findings have been issued at this stage. For legal observers, this case has become a reminder of how transparency disputes often unfold. They're usually not decided by dramatic courtroom confrontations. Instead, they develop through written filings, judicial review, document production, and careful analysis of the evidence. That slower process may not generate the same headlines, but it is often where the most significant legal decisions are made. And with the judge now reviewing the requested materials, attention is turning toward one key question: what will the evidence actually show? That answer, not speculation, will likely determine where this case goes next. As this legal battle continues, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This case is no longer just about a single group of documents. It's about how federal courts evaluate government explanations when transparency and confidentiality collide. Every administration, regardless of political party, faces lawsuits over public records. Agencies often argue that certain information must remain confidential to protect victims, preserve law enforcement interests, or comply with federal law. At the same time, journalists, advocacy groups, and members of the public argue that government agencies should be as transparent as possible, especially in cases that have generated widespread public interest. Federal judges are often asked to strike the balance between those competing principles. That's exactly why this case has attracted so much attention. The judge's latest order does not end the dispute. Instead, it begins the next stage. By requesting the original, unredacted materials for private review, the court is building a factual record before making any broader legal conclusions. That approach reflects a core principle of the judicial system: evidence comes before conclusions. For Todd Blanche and the Department of Justice, the immediate challenge is straightforward. The government must comply with the court's instructions and provide the requested materials so the judge can determine whether the legal justifications for withholding or redacting information are supported by the evidence. What happens after that depends entirely on what the judge finds. If the documents support the DOJ's position, the court could uphold many of the government's decisions. If the review reveals inconsistencies, the judge could order additional disclosures or take other procedural actions consistent with federal law. At this point, those outcomes remain possibilities, not conclusions. That distinction is essential. In today's fast-moving news environment, it's easy to confuse legal arguments, media commentary, and court rulings. But they're not the same thing. Court filings contain allegations. Lawyers present competing interpretations. Commentators offer analysis. Only the judge's written orders establish what the court has actually decided. And in this case, the judge has decided to seek more evidence before reaching any final determination. That alone makes this a case worth watching, because whatever the final outcome, the decision could influence how future disputes over government transparency and document production are handled in federal court. As new filings are submitted and the judge reviews the evidence, we'll have a much clearer picture of where this litigation is headed. Until then, the key takeaway is simple. This case remains active. The court is still gathering facts, and the most important legal questions have not yet been answered. As always, we'll continue following every major court filing and explain what it means in clear, straightforward language, without speculation, and with careful attention to the facts. If you found this breakdown helpful, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the judge's request for additional documentation is a routine legal step, or could it signal broader questions about government transparency? If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future updates on this and other major legal developments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.